Is the set of slides 1, video 1 for chapter 20, ethics. So we're going to go over the intro. I'm talking about why do we need to talk about ethics in a journalism class. Then I'm also going to go over the code of ethics, some ones that we're going to look at, including the one that we're going to look at for our homework. Then in the next set of slides, we'll get into some ethical philosophies. And then the final set of slides will go over some ways in which we can approach resolving ethical issues and talking about some of the ethical problems journalists face. And I'm going to specifically talk about plagiarism in social media. You're going to go over a lot more of the issues that are touched upon in your book when you take media law and ethics. So why do we need to talk about ethics in journalism? Hopefully it's a fairly obvious answer to that question, but just in case it isn't, there's also some kind of like theories about why it's particularly important. So in the last module, we talked about media law. And one of the biggest pieces in media law is about the First Amendment. So you're going to notice that a lot of the same things come up in this section that came up in media law around why journalists have the freedoms and have the rights that are kind of granted by the First Amendment. Why are these important to our society? So we have a responsibility in our democracy as citizens to be informed citizens, to hold the government accountable, to make sure that we kind of do our part. And part of that is for journalists to kind of seek out the truth and report it to the rest of the citizens so that we can have our democracy function properly. And, I think beyond just the theoretical issues around democracy, I think right now, given the world that we're living in and the issues we're living through, I think it is incredibly apparent that what happens when people don't know what information to trust, who to trust, what information is factually accurate or not. We saw this a lot at the beginning of the pandemic around different news organizations downplaying the issues around COVID-19. And, I was just reading the other day, obviously I see a lot of news that comes out of Britain because of my family, and I also have friends who live in Ireland, and there was Ireland shut down a lot quicker than the UK did. In the UK, it has now come out, a lot of their kind of planning and the theories they were working off of were off of either another flu pandemic and also thinking about just regular viral pneumonia rather than SARS. So in Ireland, they shut down much quicker. They canceled St. Patrick's Day, and people were talking about the kind of bizarro world they felt like they were living in when they were watching Irish news. And, there was a photograph of a group of people at a pub in Temple Bar, and there was outrage, and there was, shut the pubs was trending on Twitter. And the government said, okay, we're going to have a voluntary shutting of pubs. And then there was a real pressure to have the government shut down all pubs. And then you would flip the news, because in Ireland you get both UK and Irish news. You'd flip over to the British news stations, and there was public outrage at the government even talking about shutting the pubs. And you would just see these large groups of tens of thousands of people gathering. And unsurprisingly, if you look at the death rates per capita, the UK is about twice what the death rate is in Ireland. And a lot of that this can only go up because for example, the article that I was reading that my friend had pointed to, it's talked about a large concert that had about 50,000 people in it. And those people would have been sick at the date of writing, and the people that they infected would be dying in about 2 weeks. So, it's really important for the health of our people, like just actual physical health, as well as the health of our democracy, to be able to have news that we can trust, that we know people are drawing on the right sources, that they're vetting their sources to make sure that the sources are in fact telling the truth. You see people who have doctor after their name saying you should nebulize hydrogen peroxide in order to clean out your nasal passages, when hydrogen peroxide is known to be a irritant to your nasal passages, and you're actually just going to make yourself sick. So, making sure that people do their due diligence and follow up and make sure that the people that they're quoting are in fact people who are, actually know what they're talking about. So I hopefully, just by looking around you today, we understand what, like, the importance of being ethical in our reporting, and that in fact sometimes people's lives are on the line. Also, a thing that sometimes we don't really talk about so much is that as journalists, there are times when you have to weigh up whether it is better to do the thing that is legally correct or to do the thing that is morally correct. So, if anyone saw the movie The Post, there's real questions about whether or not it was legal for them to publish the Pentagon Papers. They're being hauled in front of Congress to answer questions about this. But Meryl Streep's character realized that, and Tom Hanks's characters realized that it was the morally right thing to do. So we're going to talk about, in these lectures, we're going to talk a little bit about how you kind of make that call, how you say, you know what, no, my moral obligation is to do this thing, which might legally be wrong, but there's a very good reason why I'm doing it, and I need to do this. So how do you make those determinations? Kind of where does the thinking come from? And how do you know beyond just trusting your gut? Because unfortunately, when it comes down to it, trusting your gut is not exactly a great defense. But there are some actual kind of theories that you can draw upon to decide whether or not, and to back up your reasoning to people who might question you on whether or not this is something you want to do. And, when we talk about looking what happens if we can't trust reporting, one of the issues is that there is a public perception of journalism and a public perception of the ethics of people who are in journalism. And, there are, your book cites different surveys that have been done, and there are surveys that are done every year about how much the public trusts the media, and every year the public trusts the media less and less. And even though trust in the media is at an all-time low, across the board, the media is more ethical than it's ever been. And yes, there are always exceptions, and I think that's the issue, is that the exceptions, there's this confirmation bias where, like, you want to believe things that confirm what you think. And so every time there's a case of someone being unethical, it just confirms to everyone that journalism as a whole is unethical, and that everyone's, they're out to hound people, that they're going to do terrible things in order to get their story, get their scoop, and sell their papers. So I did get lots of memes and cartoons and stuff for this particular lecture, because this is my jam. So, for example, there was a huge case in the UK where one of Rupert Murdoch's companies, Rupert Murdoch is the kind of patriarch and a head of Fox News, Sky Sports, he's like a media conglomerate mogul, and there was a story where there was the death of a schoolgirl. She was murdered, and they were trying to figure out who did it, and somehow, like, the papers were reporting stuff that was privileged information that no one should have known, and it turns out that they had bugged the telephone calls of this murdered schoolgirl. They had hacked into it. So there was this phone number that showed up, and people, like, the police were trying to figure out what it was, and it turns out that it was the newspaper trying to get the information because it was so salacious, and people were, really interested in this story, and it actually hindered the police's investigation. And, and that is illegal on a couple of levels. But then what it really came down to is the morals of it, and people saying, like, I can't believe you would do that not only would you hinder the police, but this poor family is dealing with the fact that their daughter's been murdered, and you're, like, hacking into their phones to get salacious information about it. That's just wrong. And that's where, like, this perception comes from, that people will do anything in order to get a scoop. We were watching the 30 for 30 yesterday about Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, and there's this footage of Tonya Harding being hounded where people in the media basically called a tow company to tow her pickup truck so that she would come out of her house in order to get her pickup truck not towed away. Like, that kind of idea sits in people's minds. So, and it kind of undoes all the good work that other investigative journalists do trying to uncover things like corruption. And the other thing is that, unfortunately, ethics can then be used kind of in bad faith against people. And so when you say, Google about ethics in journalism, you will probably come up with stuff about Gamergate. if people don't know Gamergate. It was basically a campaign that was very misogynist about to discredit, a gaming journalist. And a lot of it came down to, who she slept with, who she had relationships with. And it's like, and basically people said, no, it's not about us being misogynist against her. It's not about the fact that we don't want women in the gaming industry. It's about ethics in games journalism. And, that idea got totally ripped apart, and, it's now become a bit of a joke. But these kind of things can really affect people. And, that woman's personal details were published on the internet. She got lots of harassing phone calls, emails, text messages. She, had her personal address posted. So when you have people threatening to do you physical harm and you know that your personal details are on the internet, it's very scary. And so, these are kind of the things where we try to be ethical journalists, media creators, PR professionals, all of that stuff. And that you're ethical, but people can use this like straw man against you as well. And to be like, well, we're actually going to use your personal life against you in order to try to discredit you. So, make sure that when we are talking about ethics, that we are using this as a good faith argument, that we are actually concerned about the ethical outcomes. And I think that's where, too, looking at what the outcome actually is. Did someone give somebody a good review of a game because they bought them dinner? Or, are people dying? There's a little bit of a difference in terms of impact here. And we're going to talk about impact in a minute when we get into how we make our determinations about what's ethical and what's not ethical. So I'm going to wrap it up here. And in the next video, we're going to go into some of the codes of ethics that we can use to determine whether or not what we're doing is actually ethical.